show you the tools and we can get started. So here's the basic tools you're going to need. The first thing is you need your piece of leather to tool and the pattern of the design that you want. Just print it on a piece of paper. I would recommend it being a photocopy or a scan of it, just because you don't want to ruin something that you might need later if you're planning on recreating this project, or if the project goes wrong and you have to start again, you don't want to have to redraw the pattern if the pattern piece gets wrecked. The second thing you'll need, something to use to transfer the pattern to the leather. It should be something that has sort of a rounded end, but still somewhat pointy, so that you can get a nice fine line. This one is actually just a knitting needle. I don't really have anything at the moment that's authentic to use. I'm going to shape a piece of antler chip or bone into that kind of shape, or use the rounded end on and all for that, but that is going to happen in the future when I get a little more time to actually get onto that project and actually have access to my tools. So the next thing you'll need is a knife. You could use an X-Acto knife. My favorite to use is actually the this knife here. It's a Mora Classic 2. It's just a generic camp knife, but it's in a very traditional Scandinavian pattern, so it's just comfortable to use as well. But you could use a pocket knife or a Leatherman or something like that. That'll just be a little more uncomfortable, just because of how you have to hold it. You actually hold this one in a grip like this, pressing it sideways against your hand so that it can't slip, and that you're not digging the edge into your skin, and then you're basically running it like this. That's just the most comfortable and safe way to do it. With a pocket knife, it's basically the same, but with a shorter blade you can rest the handle against and do that. But with a Leatherman, it's still possible. It's just so top heavy that it's a little awkward, and you need to be even more careful with it, so you don't accidentally slip one direction or the other just by tilting your hand. So I don't necessarily recommend using a Leatherman, but it will work in a pinch. So the final thing you'll need is a bunch of antler tips. This particular one is used for roughing out the lines. So basically running the tip of it down the line that you've incised with a knife. It should have a nice fine rounded tip. The next one is sort of a flat, thin point that's formed from an antler chip. It also has a nice rounded profile, so you're not scratching the leather. This one's used to sort of get a little more detail and a little sharper line. This one is just a section of antler that has a smoothed end and a bit of rounded edges on it, and it's used to burnish large areas and just sort of flatten them out if there's a little bit too much texture left by a tip like this. It can also be used along the smoother edges here to run along the edges to burnish them, but I like to use this one more for that. So you can actually, instead of having to do this, you can set it down on the board and run this along the edge to round that edge, and this profile just works beautifully for that. This is a fairly rare piece because it's from an atypical antler, so you may not be able to find something like this. This might be easier for you, and again, you can use that on the side of the board. You can run it kind of like this to round the edge, and you can run it along the edge to smooth all that out and burnish it. So that's that for the tools. And again, you can, because you're making the tools yourself out of bone or antler, you can shape this to pretty much any shape or design you want, anything that will suit the job that you're doing. You can even make stamps from it, and put in different textures or different shapes that you can then emboss into the leather by striking the end of it with a mallet, or you can actually just attach a piece of this to a wooden handle. In period, probably they would have used a pine pitch glue, but nowadays you can just use epoxy. And if you want to make it look authentic, when it actually isn't, when it's done with epoxy, you can sprinkle a bit of charcoal dust around it to give it that black sheen that the pine pitch glue has. But yeah, wooden handle, mounted onto the end of it, glued on. Maybe with a small tang or something that goes inside for a little extra strength, and then striking that with a mallet to impart that shape or that design the way that you would with a modern tool. But yeah, bone and antler are sort of the plastic of the Viking Age, because they can be shaped into so many different things, as well as horn. And horn is even more plastic because you can heat it up and shape it. But that's a totally different topic. But these you can shape into any type of thing. It's kind of like a hard plastic. So let's get started with the project. A little bit forgetful. The one thing I forgot to mention is that you do need something to wet the leather with. I like to use a spray bottle. Some people like to use a bowl of water with a sponge that they can rub on it. So that's the last tool that I totally forgot. So, first thing you do is you wet your leather. You get it somewhat soaked. Generally, the first spray, you go both sides, get it nice and wet. Not so wet that it's totally soggy, because that'll take a little bit of time to work. But you want to get it so that it changes to a darker color, and that allows it to actually start to be able to take forms. That's often you may need to spray it a few times or wipe it a few times, and then once it starts to dry, that's when you use your pattern to scribe the pattern onto your leather. And the tool for this could just be a round-ended stylus or something. And if you really if it really doesn't matter to you too much with authenticity, you could just go over this pattern with a pen. Now, I think that in period, a lot of the craftsmen probably would have drawn the patterns onto the leather with a stylus of some sort, freehand, instead of using a pattern. But if they did use a pattern, it could have been drawn on some kind of an animal skin, like a vellum or something, or it could have been on a piece of fabric, or a piece of birch bark even. But I really think they probably would have just drawn it on freehand, because that kind of shows just how talented the craftsman is. So I think the leather is actually ready now to emboss the pattern. So you just want to line it up right where you want it, and sort of take a look from a distance to make sure that it's in the spot you want. And then you just start going over the lines with the stylus or whatever, pushing firmly enough to emboss the line into the leather, but not so much as to tear through your paper. You do want to be fairly accurate tracing your lines, but accuracy isn't super important, because when you're cutting it, you can kind of change your lines a little bit, because this mark isn't exactly permanently embossed into the leather or anything. It can be removed with a little bit of burnishing, and it generally doesn't show up after you've cut and tooled the leather. So there's not too much to tracing it out. So I guess what I'll do is time jump. that's the design laid out on the leather. Looks a little rough in some spots, but I'm pretty sure I can sort of fix that up as I go. There's a couple of lines that I might true up a little bit, but it should be fine. It's good to have the design in front of you while you're cutting it, so that you don't accidentally cut a line that isn't supposed to be cut, or something like that. There are a few lines that should be trued up a little bit, like to give the illusion that it's going under. These lines should probably be extended a little bit to make it more believable that this thing is passing underneath the other one. In paint it looks good. In leather carving it's good to give it that little bit more detail. So it's basically a process of just scoring along your lines, and you're just trying to break the membrane on it so that you can emboss the design in properly. And one of the things to keep in mind is just making sure that your fingers aren't in the way. Because if you're in the middle of something, focusing so hard on it, and you accidentally put your finger here and you're cutting towards it, you kind of cut yourself. So it's just being mindful of where your fingers are and where the knife is, and it should be fine. And all you really want to do is just score the leather. You don't want to cut too deeply. If you cut too deeply, it weakens it too much, and then it isn't really good for what you're using it for after that. So it's basically just scoring the lines as close as possible to what's there, if what's there is good, or just using that as a guideline to cut. And then you curve. And so I will do a time jump because this is, again, fairly self-explanatory. Just cutting along the lines that you incised, using them as mostly just rough guidelines. And don't be too disheartened if your lines are slightly crooked or anything like that. It doesn't need to be exactly perfect. That's part of the glory of handcrafts. Because if it was exactly perfect, it would be machine done. But it's always, if it's slightly off, it's good. If it's very far off, then it's very apparent that it's hand done. But if it's your first one or your 10th one or whatever, until you've done it for a long, long time, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. You'll get there eventually. You just have to practice. So I am going to do a time jump, and I'll be back in a little bit. So I guess I like to talk, and this is going to become a two-parter. I will post a link right here for part 2. Thanks for watching.